On the morning of December 8th, 1995, John Dominique Bowlby was driving his son to the theater. The editor-in-chief at Elle magazine, he was 43 years old. While on his drive, a blood vessel ruptured in his brainstem. When he woke up 20 days later, the only part of his body he could move was his left eyelid. Bowlby suffered from a condition that we now call locked-in syndrome. In the years that followed, he wrote an entire memoir by blinking. His speech therapist would recite the French alphabet ordered by letter frequency, and Bowlby would blink to stop her. The book took 200,000 blinks and 10 months of daily sessions. In a heartbreaking passage, he asks, "Does the cosmos contain a currency strong enough to buy my freedom back? We must keep looking." Today, patients like Bowlby do not have to wait 10 months to say what they want to say. They are getting a taste of a future where communication is fully restored to them, and that future is being built by artificial intelligence. I am here today to argue that the most consequential application of AI in the coming decade will be in decoding the human brain. What you see here are 4 state-of-the-art neural interfaces. These are systems implanted within the brain. And if you picture a brain implant, it's likely a paralyzed patient controlling a robotic limb, an exoskeleton, a smart wheelchair. But for these patients, decoding the brain is only one part of the story. But for patients like Bowlby, the body is not the bottleneck. They have lost their most intimate faculty, the ability to externalize the contents of their mind. These are the stories I will center my talk on today. It's not just locked-in patients. 300,000 people globally are affected by the progressive motor neuron disease, ALS, and the majority lose speech within 3 years. Overall, 3.5 million Americans require augmentative or alternative communication systems. When technology available to them is woefully inadequate, they only have access to these eye-tracking keyboards, letterboards, systems that are producing 10 to 15 words per minute when natural conversation runs at 150. We are asking these patients to communicate at 1/10 the speed of thought. The problem is, these decoders are simply as crude as the motor signals the patients retain. We only have their gaze or a single blink. Machine learning offered us a new approach. For the first time, we could read intentions not from the failing body, but from the locus where they occur, by decoding the brain. In the summer of 2020, during an internship at IBM, I worked under Kevin Brown, an algorithm engineer who pioneered one of the earliest brain decoders. When a colleague suffered a stroke that left him with locked-in syndrome, Kevin built a system that fed non-invasive EEG signals from the patient, translating his colleague's imagined motions into commands for a virtual cube that controlled his smart home. The lights, the temperature, all came back under his control. Clearly, these early non-invasive decoders already give patients back autonomy. But to reestablish communication, we had to go one step further. It is not enough to decode from the outside of the skull, where the signal is these broad electrical waves that are blurred by brain and hair. We had to go within it. Implanted brain-computer interfaces capture the firing of individual neurons, generating an enormous increase in the data. Machine learning here is no longer a helpful tool. It is the foundation of every advancement in our field. In 2023, Frank Willett's team at Stanford published a result. They implanted a 192-channel intracortical array into the motor cortex of an ALS patient. They trained a recurrent neural network on neural firing patterns, which were trying to send signals down to the muscles of speech. And they mapped those recordings to phonemes, the smallest units of language. A model then assembled these into sentences in real time, and the result was 62 words per minute, 4 times faster than any prior system. A team led by Edward Chang at UCSF achieved a comparable result with ECOG arrays, which record from the surface of the brain, and rendered it as a synthetic voice in the patient's pre-injury timbre with facial expressions animating an avatar. Looking ahead, I believe 2 architectural shifts will transform this field. The first is foundation models. Pre-trained on pooled neural recordings of thousands of patients, we will reduce per-patient calibration from weeks to minutes. The second is on-device inference, running on neuromorphic chips small enough to live inside the brain itself. At the current rate of progress, by 2035, a paralyzed patient could plausibly speak in real time with no wires tethering them to their hospital bed. But something trained to decode a phoneme could plausibly be trained to decode a thought. That's where we're going. And it's not as far off as we think. Scientists at UT Austin used functional fMRI to build a semantic decoder that can detect the gist of stories or imagined speech. In 2017, Elon Musk pitched Neuralink as a tool to replace the slow, imprecise nature of verbal communication for the general public and replace it with telepathic exchange. I am here today to urge you, we cannot let that happen. The weaker version of this technology, non-invasive EEG, is already being required by employers. In government-run factories in China, workers wear EEG sensors that monitor their productivity and are sent home if their brains reveal poor concentration or emotional agitation. Here in America, Amazon-branded delivery vans use AI cameras to monitor drivers' faces for their entire 12-hour shifts. The line between safety and surveillance is growing thin. And if Amazon had access to a more detailed profile of their drivers' states, do you think they wouldn't take it? Now imagine these devices could decode not just alertness, but thoughts. Dissident thoughts, vulgar thoughts, secret thoughts. If private companies are allowed to manufacture and operate invasive neural implants, we face a future where brain data becomes as commonplace and as public as our online footprints. We leave the market to decide who can demand it of us and what they use it for. When consumer behavior changing means the difference in billions of dollars, do we trust those in charge, our employers, insurers, governments, military, to have our best interests at heart? We've seen what happens to every other form of personal data. If neural data enters that pipeline, it further concentrates power in private hands. For us to promote human flourishing and autonomy, we cannot volunteer our most intimate domain to those who wish to control us. What I foresee is not just a larger version of the transgression we all felt when we realized our smartphones were listening to our conversations. The risk is of a completely new nature. It strikes at the heart of our cognitive freedom. Each of us generates a sense of self by sorting through our thoughts, a judgment you make and later overturn, a wrong answer you catch before it becomes public, a cruel impulse you examine and reject. The ability to decide which parts of your stream of consciousness are authentically you is the basis of identity itself. If we even suspect that that stream is being decoded and relayed to employers, insurers, our government, we will not just self-censor our speech, we will self-censor our thoughts. If your genuine stream of consciousness was available at their fingertips, would you trust the manufacturer not to peek? To save us from this fate, while delivering this technology to those that need it, there are 3 safeguards we must pass as law. The first is where these devices decode from. The different parts of the brain produce different parts of consciousness. The motor cortex sends signals to the body, and we believe the prefrontal cortex and default mode network are where spontaneous thoughts live. We must write into law that invasive neural decoders only ever get implanted in the motor cortex. Andrea Lavazza, a neuroethicist, proposes a layered sensitivity model for brain data, in which motor intention is the least private and spontaneous thought is the most. Since the strongest current neuroprostheses for speech already decode from the motor cortex, the most clinically effective strategy is also the most ethically defensible. The second safeguard is for how the data flows. Even motor cortex signals may carry faint traces of other internal states, and as data sets grow, future models may extract more about users' minds than we anticipate. To safeguard against this, we must mandate that raw neural data never leaves the implant. The same chip that records the signal must also host the network that decodes them. In this way, only abstracted outputs, like an intended phoneme, are ever transmitted to the manufacturers. Chile's 2021 constitutional amendment protecting brain activity and the information derived from it is the legal template. We must adopt this worldwide. The third safeguard is who is allowed to build these devices at all. No matter how carefully we draw those first two lines, this field is in its infancy. Our inability to predict advancements in the next month, let alone in the next decade, means these guidelines cannot be guaranteed watertight. A sufficiently motivated company will find the loophole. The only true fail-safe is to keep this technology clinical, full stop. These systems belong alongside pacemakers and cochlear implants, not consumer wearables, not productivity tools, not enhancement devices for the healthy. The line between medical necessity and a lifestyle product is the line between restoration and surveillance, and it must be drawn before we let the market draw it for us. We are early enough in history that this technology hasn't yet escaped into the consumer market. And at MIT, as leaders in technology, we have the influence to guide the future of this sector. We must do it right for the patients who need it. Mental decoding represents the highest stakes application of AI in history. It is also the most life-changing for its users. Baubi asked us, does the cosmos contain a currency strong enough to buy my freedom back? I believe we have found it. Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you, Rachel. Questions? Yes, Brian.
I wanted to just ask a question about that last point, the last safeguard about consumer wearables versus clinical, clinical-only uses. I'm just curious. Suppose we had the promise of some enhancement devices or something that was going to help me in my day-to-day, even as a sort of completely healthy person. And suppose I were to consent to having it implanted and take my chances with what data might be shared to a company, right? So I just look at the possible benefits. I weigh them against the possible risks of loss of data privacy, and I judge for myself that they're worth the risks.
For sure.
Why shouldn't I be allowed to do that? Or are you thinking, well, even though I might be making a fine decision for myself, we need to ban this because it's a kind of a collective action problem, and we shouldn't let people be pushed in that direction.
I think I'd say two things, which is that first, I'm mostly concerned about the numbers and the general public, and I never want the general public, the layman, to face a system where they lack information and they can't effectively consent. I would also say, if you can show me a single example of a system that previously has collected personal data to this degree and has not been abused, I would be far more partial to opening this to the consumer market. The problem is we have no example, no single case. That being said, I don't think that it's worth us fighting a single individual or even a handful of them on this topic. If you want to go into your garage and even strap a car battery to your head and electro-stimulate yourself, you're at liberty to do it. I think that we should, as MIT, be thinking on a pretty large scale about guiding consumer behavior and policy because of that.
Great. Rachel.
Thank you so much. I have a question about regulation. So you were talking about regulation at a super high level, which is great. I have a question about regulation at a much more granular level. So I have a friend who suffered in a terrible accident and they became tetraplegic. This was in the UK. They're guaranteed access to a wheelchair, but the process of actually acquiring access to a wheelchair was sort of comically terrible. And in the end, the process whereby they got fitted with a wheelchair, they ended up in an unsafe wheelchair. The person who was in charge of assigning them the wheelchair was kind of completely oblivious to the various kinds of, very high stakes constraints that his body was subject to and so on. So I guess the thought is you can have regulation at a pretty high level of abstraction that seems good, but that is a complete failure at the more sort of granular level of guaranteeing the kinds of autonomy and safety we might want. So I was just wondering whether you'd thought about how to translate these very kind of high-level abstract regulatory frameworks down into a more granular framework. Because it seems like you could just have a case where everything looks good at a really high level of abstraction, but in resource-poor clinical contexts, the ability of clinicians or technicians to actually sort of practice in line with the spirit of those regulations is seriously impaired.
Yeah, you're totally right, and I think your question kind of touches on two sides of this. One of them is obviously access to this technology, and the fact that at least at the beginning, at least right now, it's basically only in these very well-resourced environments that these test patients are getting access to these state-of-the-art decoders. And my hope is honestly that we bring more attention to this topic in the public eye, so that there's more kind of funding mechanisms. Because this state, I think, I've identified locked-in syndrome because it is the most egregious if it goes untreated in any environment anywhere in the world. The other thing is about like the granularity of our regulation. That's why I wanted to frame the kind of safeguards as things that happen with regard to the market, because those, at least to my understanding, economists have an ability to interact with policies that affect the vast majority, if not every person in a given country at a time. It's kind of difficult then to try to rationalize at the level of single hospitals how you would ensure that these devices would be equitably sorted through. And I think that we can leave the decision-making about how to implement them within the clinical system where regulations are excruciatingly tight anyways. You're right, there are obviously failure modes. But the failure mode I'm most worried about is if this leaks into the general public, right? Outside of our control entirely.
Great.
Thank you. Excellent talk. Fascinating area.
Thank you.
I have a technical question. You're talking about using machine learning to figure out the interpretation of the signals, and you pointed out that you can't just put something on somebody's head because the signals get diffused. How many people are going to have implants in order for you to get the amount of training data that you need? And how is that going to happen?
That's a fantastic question. So currently, the way that these devices work is actually usually within a single individual. So with the extracortical arrays, even with the patients like the one you saw on the screen with the UCSF example, the difficulty is that you end up recording simultaneously from the implant within the patient while they're performing these communication tasks using their traditional technology, so that we at least have a map between neural firing and their intended outputs. And the burden right now falls on the team collecting the data, which takes on the order of weeks to train the model per patient. So my hope with foundation models is that if we pool that data collectively, even that process from the data that we have collected in these very few patients would decrease this calibration time. But it's not so much a technical requirement that we have, say, thousands of individuals for these devices to work in the first place, if that makes sense.
Great. Kevin.
Thank you. I agree that it's scary to have your private thoughts be read up, and it seems like a good case to push back on. But is there a reason why you think this is the place to draw the line? So as you say, we already have the technology to hear what pretty much most of us say for most of our lives, just in our private conversations. Why shouldn't we be focusing on we should ban AI use of reading whatever you're saying that your smartphone can hear, and so on? Why are we focusing on brain imaging?
I think it's a huge philosophical distinction between the outputs that you are volunteering by using your motor system to type or to speak in the first place. It bypasses the stream of consciousness. It's one level beyond, right? You've used your volition to make that externalized, known. And therefore, that's probably why these companies have gotten away with it so much, because you did choose to say that. You said that on your phone call, you said that in your living room to your friend. Whereas the case here is for thoughts that are on your interiority, things you didn't explicitly want to externalize. And I think that domain change, it makes it a completely new problem, where when we think about surveillance, this would be a deeply intimate, especially terrifying version.
First, congratulations on working on such an incredibly important topic, and
second, thank you, because as an economist, it's the first time I hear someone say something nice about economists. So it's just, it is totally unexpected. It just, so I think you're asking the right questions, and that's and how we economists will think about this. We'll start first with the very big questions and then go to the details. So what you want to do is to kind of think about how you can develop the technology and at the same time regulate the uses. So I just want to know if you are thinking deeper into that area, or this is where you are right now, and then I will encourage you to go further. But congratulations and thank you. There are so many economists here that are happy. You have no idea.
I'm so glad. As you kind of mentioned, I'm almost too close to the forest. It's too close to the forest to see the trees. Because working in this field, I want this technology to be developed. That's actually the highest stakes application, is that we keep developing these devices and we make them faster and we make them better. And I would defer to all of the infrastructure that we have around the medical system, the regulatory systems that should be working to protect this kind of thing, and that I'm concerned aren't. And I don't think I'm necessarily the one with my 3 safeguards, I'm gonna save the world. I think my job is much more as an engineer to vouch for this particular application as an area of bigger public interest.
Great.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm really interested in whether you've thought through like carrots and sticks of how to regulate. So in terms of, for example, like any incentives you've thought of to give either tech companies to not get into this space, because or even governments, because I'm imagining like this could be used in defense tech immediately, from the government perspective, or for technology, like tech companies, like it could go anywhere. So just curious as to your thoughts.
It's a super good question, and the furthest I think I've got is submitting something to this competition where I knew there was a platform for me to finally talk about it, because I don't know how to engage with these other systems. I'm scared of the military use. I'm very scared of the government surveillance use, and I think the only thing I can do as a solo individual is speak about it more broadly, unfortunately. It's a great question.
Great.
What are your thoughts about the case where the person disowns the thoughts that are being translated from their own brain?
That's a fantastic question. And I am obviously extremely worried that imagine you implant one of these devices, we all get comfortable enough that we robustly trust the outputs as decoding that person's motor intention, but then the model on chip starts to drift. That person might have no ability to communicate that it's making errors, right? If the very system we're trusting with communication is the one that's faulty. So the only way around this is to have these in clinically supervised environments where these devices are being heavily scrutinized and routinely checked by practitioners who have a vested interest in this person's well-being, essentially. Maybe it's as much as catching a single bug that causes their clinician to investigate the state of the device, and we could fail-safe protect it that way.
Great.
Hi, I have a quick question over on this side.
Oh, yeah.
This all sounds fascinating, and it's probably quite costly. From a perspective of cost, to drive down costs, you would need other use cases so that people see the benefit of it, and then there are more applications of it. I understand there's always a concern for somebody to abuse. It's happening already with AI today. However, do you see any other use cases that would make it more of a general application across the industry that would help avert some of the costs for some of the cases that you're including here?
That is a fantastic question, and my dad actually gave me some pushback as well on this topic, because he said he has chronic pain in his left toe. He's had it for 20 years. If we could give him a device in his brain, it might not be in the motor region, but he would like to be able to turn the pain off. I think that as long as we're being mindful of bringing people back up to a baseline level of health by using this technology, I'm actually not opposed to other applications of it, specifically in the motor and sensory systems, because I think those are the two where you're actually interfacing with the outside world. You don't necessarily bake in this fear of decoding intention and thoughts as vividly. So I would also say that I think prosthetics actually are kind of in the limelight right now. So like what we see the work being done in the media lab. And I just want speech prostheses to get that same time and the same public interest so that these tech companies do invest in these very public, very interesting media cases if they were to take it more seriously.
Great, and last question.
You've had some.
Sorry, last question.
You've had some really great questions about how fragile these systems are, especially foundation models trained on fMRI data. I've worked with them. They predict the average more often than not, and so they fail on anybody who has different neurocognition.
Yep.
But that's just the normal fragility we're all used to with these models in every clinical setting. What are you going to do when, presumably they're not going to be hardwired all the time, right? There's going to be wireless communication. What are you going to do when it's hacked?
When it's hacked?
Yeah. Everything's hackable.
So my vision for this second proposal about on-device inference is essentially that those systems should never be the ones linking wirelessly to any other hub in the entire world. I want neuromorphic chips that are running inference, completely contained within the skull, unable to be interacted with. And I realize that already is a hardware projection I'm making about the next 10 years as someone who loves neuromorphic engineering. But you're completely right, and brain jacking is, of course, a risk that needs to be discussed in these kind of implant cases. I think that we do safeguard against it by keeping it in patient pools, where I don't think that there's nearly as much incentive for malagents to interact with these patients as if it was a consumer project, as if it was in the general public, right? We're at least containing the risk to few people that are already in a regulated system. But a great question, very good question.
And I'm afraid that's it. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you.